I want you to just take a second and picture a monastery.
Right, just get that image in your head.
Yeah, because for most of us, that conjures a very specific, almost cinematic aesthetic. You're likely imagining this imposing, silent stone fortress.
Maybe clinging to a remote cliffside somewhere.
Exactly. Or buried deep in an inaccessible forest, right?
Hmm.
Inside those thick walls, you picture solitary figures in these heavy, unadorned robes moving slowly through cloistered walkways.
Heads bowed.
Heads bowed, completely silent, just entirely severed from the economic and political machinery of the outside world.
It's an image that is really defined by absence.
Absence of noise, absence of wealth.
Absence of societal engagement. Yeah.
But looking at the historical record, that isolated, silent building you are picturing was, more often than not, an ancient version of a bustling, self-sustaining metropolis.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. We are talking about massive complexes commanding vast agricultural operations.
Pioneering complex hospital systems.
Yes. And operating commercial-scale breweries. Even serving as the epicenter for intense, high-stakes political drama.
The contrast between that cultural myth and the historical reality is just, it's stark.
So stark. And that structural evolution is exactly what we're going to be exploring today. Welcome to your custom-tailored deep dive.
It's going to be a fascinating one.
It really is. Our mission today is to unpack a comprehensive examination of monasteries, exploring how the core concept of, well, living alone actually birthed some of the most formidable communal engines of civilization.
Education, too.
Oh, absolutely. And even a few historical murder mysteries, which we'll get to later.
Can't forget the murder mysteries.
Right. Okay, let's unpack this because to truly understand these institutions, we have to strip away the romanticized stereotype of monastics just sitting in an endless passive contemplation.
Right, and to begin deconstructing that stereotype, we really have to examine the foundational blueprint of the monastery itself, which immediately presents us with a striking linguistic contradiction.
Oh, the etymology.
Yes. The English word monastery actually derives from the Greek word monastorion.
Okay.
And that term is anchored by the root monos, which translates literally and unambiguously to alone.
So the etymology alone highlights the paradox we're talking about.
Exactly.
We use a word that fundamentally means alone to describe sprawling complexes where hundreds and historically thousands of individuals lived in super dense proximity.
Right. And what's fascinating here is that evolution from the purely solitary hermit, which was the original uncompromising form of the early Christian monastic, to the staggering self-sustaining estates of the medieval period.
It wasn't just a sudden jump, though.
No, not at all. But the architectural layout of a typical developed monastic complex, it extended way beyond a simple chapel or a space for worship.
It became a highly engineered, closed-loop ecosystem.
Ecosystem is an apt descriptor, yeah.
If you examine the infrastructure of these complexes, they resemble, well, basically a medieval iteration of a massive corporate campus.
Or an independent municipality.
Exactly. Beyond the dormitories and the cloisters designed for contemplation, you have the refectories.
The communal dining halls.
Right. And extensive libraries, balnearies for bathing, and really sophisticated infirmaries.
And depending on the geographic and economic context, they operated with the industrial capacity of many cities.
Totally. We see dedicated barns, forges for metalworking.
Hospices to manage the flow of pilgrims and travelers.
Schools, and as I mentioned earlier, highly profitable breweries. The whole design was predicated entirely on achieving absolute self-sufficiency.
And this architectural pursuit of the self-sufficient spiritual community, it's a genuinely global phenomenon.
It's not just a European thing.
Not at all. The specific terminology shifts to reflect the geographic and theological context, obviously, but the core structural ambition remains remarkably consistent.
Like in the Buddhist tradition, right?
Yes. Within Buddhism, the generic nomenclature is often vihara. If you analyze the Tibetan landscape, these structures are termed gompas.
Whereas in Southeast Asian regions like Thailand or Cambodia, they are designated as wats.
Exactly.
And in the Western Christian tradition, the vocabulary expands to include abbeys, priories, or hermitages.
Concurrently, within Hinduism, the equivalent structural and functional entities are established as mathas, or ashrams.
So the impulse is universal even if the names change.
Right, and to truly conceptualize how far this institutional reality drifted from that Greek root word monos, we can look at specific historical benchmarks.
Oh, like the Drepung Monastery.
The Drepung Monastery in Tibet is a prime example of this extreme scale.
The demographics of Drepung are they're difficult to reconcile with the concept of a spiritual retreat.
Very difficult.
Because prior to the Chinese invasion in the 1950s, that single monastery housed a population of approximately 10,000 monks.
10,000? It's a staggering demographic concentration.
Right. But at that scale, 10,000 people living within a single complex, does it even function as a monastic retreat anymore?
Or does it inevitably morph into a secular municipality with a religious veneer?
Exactly. Because the sheer logistical burden of managing sanitation, securing supply chains for food, and maintaining internal governance for 10,000 people.
It requires a massive bureaucracy.
The bureaucracy that seems completely antithetical to ascetic withdrawal.
Even today, the relocated iteration of Drepung in India manages a population of around 8,000. It is still a massive administrative undertaking.
The line between spiritual community and civic administration undeniably blurs at that magnitude, which logically leads us to the question of origins.
Right. The why and the how.
Yeah. How did the disparate practices of individual spiritual withdrawal coalesce into these highly organized, densely populated communal settlements?
Historical drivers point to catalysts that are surprisingly pragmatic.
And in some cases, entirely environmental.
Yes. The shift toward communal living was not always the result of some grand theological master plan. Often it was simply dictated by the weather.
Which is so interesting. The meteorological origins of Buddhist monasticism are a perfect example of this. If we look at the genesis of Buddhism around the 4th century BCE, the early monks and nuns were wandering mendicants.
Their practice relied on constant travel and reliance on alms.
Right. However, the South Asian climate presented an unavoidable logistical barrier.
The wet season.
The monsoons.
Yeah, the Vasa retreat.
Exactly, the Vasa. The Vasa dictates a roughly 3-month period, typically commencing in mid-July, characterized by intense monsoons.
Continual travel during this window exposed these mendicants to severe physical risk.
Getting stranded, getting sick.
Right. But beyond simple self-preservation, there was a deeply rooted theological mandate for ceasing travel.
Oh, because of the new plant growth.
Exactly. They were obligated to remain stationary to avoid trampling the new plant growth and the proliferation of insects that emerged during the rains.
It is a direct operationalization of the core principle of non-harming.
Ahimsa.
Ahimsa, yes. But the practical consequence of this theological mandate was that large transient populations of mendicants required static infrastructure for a quarter of the year.
Right. You can't just have hundreds of people standing in a field for 3 months.
Right. So wealthy lay supporters recognized this recurring logistical bottleneck.
And they stepped in.
They did. They began donating enclosed parks and structural pavilions specifically for the Sangha to utilize during the Vasa.
And human sociology essentially takes over from there.
Yeah. You have a secure property, reliable infrastructure, and a community confined together for 3 months. Gradually, the custom calcified.
It became permanent.
These properties, which were held in common by the community, transitioned from temporary shelters into permanent, year-round Cenobitic monasticism.
The shared experience of waiting out the rain forged the permanent Buddhist monastery.
It's amazing. It highlights a brilliant environmental adaptation shaping the entire trajectory of a global religion.
It really does. Now, if we pivot to the origins of Christian monasticism, the environmental pressures were distinct, but the evolutionary trajectory from solitary asceticism to organized communalism is equally revealing.
The harshness of the Egyptian desert served as the crucible for early Christian monasticism, right?
Yes. Figures like Anthony the Great represent the absolute extreme of the monos ideal.
He was a radical hermit.
Radical is the word. He retreated into deep desert caves, actively minimizing any intersection with human society.
Just completely isolating himself.
Yet, maintaining absolute, indefinite psychological and physical isolation is an incredibly precarious undertaking.
I can imagine. The human mind is rarely equipped to sustain pure solitude without severe degradation.
Right. And recognizing this vulnerability, the historical record introduces a pivotal transitional architect, a figure named Amonas.
Amonas.
He observed the psychological attrition among the Desert Fathers and engineered a hybrid model.
A sort of middle ground.
Exactly. Under his system, ascetics maintained their solitary existence, but they were clustered in close enough proximity to offer mutual logistical and psychological support.
Kind of like living in the same apartment building, but never hanging out except when there's an emergency.
Basically. And eventually, this led to instituting mandatory communal gatherings on Sundays.
It is the invention of a spiritual neighborhood.
That's a great way to put it.
You retain the autonomy of your individual cave, but you have a localized safety net if the physical elements or psychological strain become overwhelming.
But the true architectural leap to the centralized, highly regulated monastery required a different kind of organizational genius.
And one drawn from a completely unexpected sector.
The military.
Yes, Pachomius the Great. He's the figure credited with formalizing Christian Cenobitic monasticism.
The system where renunciates live, labor, and worship under a single roof, bound by a uniform set of rules.
And the methodology Pachomius utilized is fascinating because his background wasn't entirely rooted in theological study.
No, prior to his ascetic withdrawal, Pachomius actually served as a conscripted soldier in the Roman army.
Which is such a wild pivot. But it represents this profound cross-pollination of institutional frameworks.
He took the rigid, highly efficient structures of the Roman military barracks and directly transposed them onto the disorganized fervor of desert asceticism.
Applying military hierarchy to a spiritual pursuit initially seems counterintuitive. I mean, you are essentially trading internal, unguided spiritual discovery for external, enforced compliance.
It does seem contradictory. But if you have hundreds or thousands of zealous ascetics wandering the desert without infrastructure,
the result is administrative chaos.
Complete chaos. Pachomius recognized that scaling asceticism required the mechanisms of a military platoon.
So he instituted rigid daily schedules.
Standardized uniforms.
A strict chain of command, centralized housing. He essentially weaponized the operational efficiency of the Roman legion to support a massive population of spiritual seekers.
And the efficacy of that structural transposition was immediate and staggering.
The Nitria region of the Egyptian desert quickly transformed into what was known as the Holy City.
Historical estimates suggest that under these highly organized models, upwards of 50,000 monks were sustained in that desert environment at any given time.
50,000 people in the desert. Sustaining 50,000 individuals in an unforgiving environment proves that the underlying logistical framework was nearly flawless.
It had to be.
But managing a population of that density requires an uncompromising regulatory environment. Living inside one of these hyper-organized communal structures meant submitting to a daily reality of absolute, unwavering discipline.
Which brings us to the operational reality of the Western Christian schedule.
Heavily influenced by the rule of St. Benedict.
Yes. It was an existence defined by rigorous self-abnegation where the concept of labor and the concept of prayer were inextricably fused.
And the schedule was utterly relentless. It was designed to systematically break down individual autonomy. A monk's entire existence was subjugated to the rhythm of the divine office.
We're looking at a continuous cycle of communal prayer. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, daily mass, sext, none, vespers, and compline.
The psychological impact of that schedule cannot be overstated, particularly regarding sleep architecture.
Right, because matins required the community to rise in the deep hours of the night.
Fundamentally fragmenting their sleep cycle.
Every single night.
Their entire consciousness was tethered to communal worship, with strictly portioned intervals allocated for manual labor, agricultural management, or scriptorium work.
And the division of labor was heavily systematized.
Yeah, those with scholastic aptitude were assigned to the scriptorium, engaging in the grueling, freezing work of hand-copying manuscripts.
A labor-intensive process that is directly responsible for the preservation of countless historical texts.
And those lacking scholastic inclination, they were deployed into the physical machinery of the complex.
Working the forges, managing the livestock, maintaining the agricultural yield required to keep the community solvent.
And the discipline extended heavily into their biological needs, specifically the refectory.
The communal dining space.
Yeah, the refectory offers a profound window into the behavioral constraints of these institutions. The primary meal, typically occurring around noon, was an exercise in extreme austerity.
The dietary baseline was highly restricted. We're looking at staples like poached fish, dark bread, root vegetables.
Eggs, cheese, boiled oats.
But the psychological weight of the meal wasn't the food, it was the acoustic environment.
A mandate of absolute silence was enforced throughout the entire service. The only permitted sound was the voice of a single monk reading scripture or theological texts from an elevated pulpit.
Which introduces a complex logistical hurdle.
Exactly. How does a large group of people efficiently manage the mechanics of a shared meal, passing salt, requesting bread, communicating basic physical needs, while under the threat of severe penalization for uttering a single syllable?
Well, they bypassed the vocal cords entirely.
They developed a localized, complex system of sign language.
Yes.
The imagery of this is incredible. You have a cavernous stone dining hall, hundreds of men eating austere meals in total acoustic silence while the scriptures echo off the walls.
And simultaneously, underneath that religious veneer, there is a furious, silent exchange of hand gestures just to facilitate the distribution of a block of cheese.
It perfectly illustrates how human pragmatism always finds a way to navigate rigid, top-down constraints.
It is a brilliant adaptation to a highly constrained environment. And speaking of physical constraints, we really must analyze the thermal realities of these complexes.
Oh, the calefactory.
Specifically the role of the calefactory, yes.
The warming house. The thermal dynamics of medieval monasticism strip away any lingering romanticism you might have left.
In the sprawling, uninsulated stone architecture of a standard medieval monastery, the calefactory was frequently the singular room in the entire complex where a fire was permitted to be lit.
Consider the physical toll of that environment during a European winter.
It's brutal.
You are inhabiting a massive stone structure. You have been awake since 2 a.m. for the night offices. You have been engaged in either physical labor in frozen fields or sitting rigidly in an unheated scriptorium.
And your caloric intake is minimal.
Minimal. The calefactory becomes the singular epicenter of survival,
Dozens of freezing individuals huddled around one hearth.
likely utilizing those complex hand gestures to communicate their physical misery.
Probably. It highlights the brutal, uncompromising physiological reality of ascetic life.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture, it is precisely this brutal internal discipline and centralized labor force that positioned monasteries as the foundational pillars of early societal infrastructure.
Absolutely. They operated as highly resilient hubs capable of absorbing external shocks that would otherwise shatter medieval society.
Their operational portfolio is essentially the blueprint for the modern civic state.
When catastrophic plagues decimated regional populations, the strict internal organization of the monasteries allowed them to mobilize as frontline healthcare providers.
Managing the sick and maintaining agricultural output when secular supply chains collapsed.
They were the premier hospitals and emergency response networks of the medieval era.
And their capacity for systematic preservation and innovation catalyzed the cultural and intellectual development of Europe, too.
Like the standardization of musical notation.
Right. That's heavily attributed to a monk named Notker of St. Gall.
Because these monasteries were not isolated islands, but nodes in a vast, interconnected continental network.
Innovations like standardized musical notation or agricultural techniques could be rapidly transmitted across thousands of miles. They functioned as an analog internet.
That's a great analogy. Furthermore, the structural DNA of the modern university system was synthesized directly within the monastic framework.
Because these institutions monopolized literacy and possessed extensive libraries, they naturally became gravitational centers for intellectual pursuit.
Lay people and scholars began traveling to them not merely for religious absolution, but for academic engagement.
And the architectural legacy of this transition is still visible today.
Think about the spatial hierarchy of the monastic refectory,
where the abbot and distinguished guests occupied an elevated high table, while the general community sat perpendicular in strict order of seniority.
That layout was directly absorbed by early academic institutions.
If you observe the dining halls of Oxford or Cambridge today, you are looking at a replicated monastic refectory. The entire modern academic apparatus is built on an architectural and operational foundation laid by ascetics.
The embedded legacy is undeniable. However, analyzing the global expansion of monasticism reveals that this framework was highly malleable.
It wasn't one size fits all.
No. As the concept permeated different geographic, economic, and cultural landscapes, it underwent significant structural mutations.
Frequently diverging sharply from the original rigid ascetic ideals of Pachomius or Benedict.
The structural variations are deeply revealing. Analyzing the Eastern Orthodox Church demonstrates a completely different approach to organization.
Unlike the Roman Catholic system, which compartmentalized into distinct branded orders, your Franciscans, your Dominicans, your Benedictines.
The Eastern Orthodox tradition maintains a unified monastic identity that operates on a sliding scale of intensity.
They utilize a tripartite structural model.
At one extreme, you have the hermit,
preserving the foundational isolation of Anthony the Great, pursuing extreme individual asceticism.
And at the opposite pole is the cenobium, the highly regimented communal structure where labor, resources, and worship are entirely collectivized.
Now, the psychological rationale behind the cenobium is articulated through a remarkably perceptive analogy in our sources.
The smooth rocks analogy.
Yes, Participating in Cenobitic life is likened to a collection of rocks with sharp, irregular edges being tossed together into a confined space.
The perpetual friction of communal living, the unavoidable personality conflicts, the subjugation of the individual ego to the collective will, the daily grind of shared labor, it acts as a polishing mechanism.
The friction slowly grinds away the sharp edges of the ego, resulting in a community of smooth, polished stones.
It is an incredibly accurate psychological assessment of the abrasive nature of intense communal living.
It demonstrates a very sophisticated understanding of group dynamics as a tool for ego suppression.
And situated right between the absolute isolation of the hermit and the total collectivization of the cenobium, the Orthodox tradition deployed the skete.
The skete operates as the pragmatic middle ground. It is essentially a micro-community.
Typically consisting of a single elder and a minimal number of disciples.
They maintain individual autonomy for prayer and labor throughout the majority of the week, but consolidate on Sundays and feast days.
It provides the psychological safety net Amona's envisioned without the bureaucratic crushing weight of the massive cenobium.
But here's where it gets really interesting, because the evolution of monasticism wasn't purely a theological refinement.
Far from it.
In many regions, the pursuit of ascetic poverty inverted entirely, transforming monasteries into formidable economic cartels that fundamentally rewrote their own operating rules.
The accumulation and management of vast wealth by institutions theoretically dedicated to poverty is a recurring historical theme.
Despite unambiguous theological mandates, such as the Buddhist Vinaya Code, which strictly prohibited the handling of currency or the accumulation of personal wealth.
The practical reality of sustained land donations inevitably transformed many monasteries into massive economic powerhouses, acting as feudal lords.
The economic mechanics of this shift are just fascinating.
Yeah.
In the context of Chinese Buddhism, the monastery ceased to be merely a spiritual retreat and became the primary economic engine of the region.
Peasant populations were utilized to cultivate monastic-owned land,
paying a fixed percentage of their agricultural yield directly to the resident monastic community.
functioning exactly as a secular taxation system under a feudal lord.
The monks were the landlords, and the spiritual complex was essentially a vast agricultural holding company.
And the administrative pressure of managing massive generational wealth inevitably fractures the traditional mandates of celibacy and non-attachment.
Right, if an institution controls a vast property portfolio, the imperative to maintain control of those assets often overrides theological constraints.
The historical record shows that in regions like Sri Lanka and within Tibetan Buddhism, the ownership and administrative control of a monastery could become vested entirely within a single individual.
Which creates an immediate succession crisis for a celibate monk.
Naturally.
If you control a highly profitable estate and lack direct biological heirs, how do you retain the wealth within the family unit?
The systemic workaround was nepotism.
Control of the monastery and its accompanying wealth was routinely passed to a nephew who was subsequently ordained.
It transformed the spiritual institution into a closed-loop familial inheritance system.
And in Japan, the civil authorities eventually formalized this deviation by legally permitting Buddhist clerics to marry.
Consequently, the position of head abbot at major temples transitioned into a strictly hereditary title.
Passed directly from father to son across generations.
It completely dismantles the conventional definition of a renunciate monk.
It is a profound demonstration of institutional adaptability. The theological ideals inevitably mold to the economic and legal contours of their host environment.
We observe a similar magnitude of institutional pivoting within the Christian tradition, particularly in the shockwave following the Protestant Reformation.
The Reformation completely rewired the geopolitical and theological map of Europe.
And the monasteries had to adapt or face dissolution.
In newly established Lutheran territories, certain monastic institutions didn't simply close. They executed a theological pivot.
They adopted the Lutheran doctrine and continued their communal operations under a drastically revised theological framework.
And the trajectory of Protestant communal living continued to generate novel structural experiments well into the modern era.
By the mid-20th century, specifically the 1960s, we see the emergence of highly unconventional monastic iterations.
The 1960s produced experiments that directly challenged centuries of rigid segregation. We see the formation of intentional communities operating on a monastic chassis, but with revolutionary modifications.
They were co-educational.
Housing men and women within the same complex.
And they explicitly permitted marriage and child-rearing while maintaining a communal economic and spiritual structure.
And the drive to synthesize monastic structures with contemporary economic realities hasn't slowed down. Examining modern monastic operations reveals adaptations that sound almost satirical until you realize the underlying pragmatism.
Right. To maintain economic solvency in the 21st century, modern monasteries have expanded their revenue streams far beyond agriculture and brewing.
It is now entirely plausible to engage a cloistered monastic community for comprehensive IT support
Software development.
and complex accounting services.
The juxtaposition is brilliant.
You have individuals bound by ancient vows of stability and obedience managing corporate tax ledgers and server infrastructure.
But it perfectly aligns with the original mandate of self-sufficiency.
If the medieval economy demanded illuminated manuscripts and agricultural yields to survive, the modern digital economy demands data management and financial auditing.
The economic vehicle has updated, but the underlying drive for institutional independence remains exactly the same.
It highlights the extreme resilience of the model.
And it is precisely this tension, the stark boundary between the secretive, regulated internal world of the monastery and the curiosity of the secular society surrounding it, that has made these institutions a permanent fixture of fascination and anxiety within popular culture.
The secular society has always viewed the closed doors of a monastery with a potent mixture of deep reverence and intense suspicion.
The architectural reality of a walled-off complex operating under autonomous, unquestionable authority is essentially a blank canvas for societal projection.
If you isolate a population and implement a rigid behavioral code, the outside world will inevitably assume that explosive secrets are being harbored within.
This psychological dynamic is vividly mapped across centuries of literature.
The literary record serves as an excellent barometer for how society perceives the monastic threat or utility.
Matthew Lewis's 1796 Gothic masterpiece, The Monk, perfectly encapsulates the era's anxiety regarding unchecked religious authority.
Set against the backdrop of the Spanish Inquisition, it utilizes the fictionalized monastery not as a sanctuary, but as an impenetrable fortress, shielding profound moral corruption and hypocrisy.
It leverages the ultimate Gothic trope, the institution demanding absolute external purity while festering with internal depravity.
Conversely, Jane Austen approaches the institution from a deeply pragmatic socio-economic angle in Northanger Abbey.
Austen weaponizes the setting of a repurposed abbey to highlight a much darker historical utility of convents.
For centuries, these institutions frequently functioned not as destinations for genuine spiritual calling, but as convenient socio-economic dumping grounds.
If an aristocratic family possessed surplus daughters,
Or if a woman proved unwilling or unable to secure a politically advantageous marriage,
the convent served as a socially acceptable mechanism for removing her from the economic chessboard.
it was in many cases a punitive exile cloaked in religious piety.
Austen highlights the transactional nature of these institutions within patriarchal structures.
Moving into the realm of profound psychological and philosophical analysis, Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov offers an unparalleled dissection of the power dynamics inherent in Orthodox monasticism.
Dostoevsky doesn't rely on Gothic tropes.
No, he dissects the very real, very intense psychological machinery of the institution.
He zeroed in on the concept of elderhood, the immense, almost absolute spiritual authority concentrated in a single charismatic elder.
Drawing heavily from authentic historical texts regarding the elders of Oftina, he explores the volatile mix of intense devotion, the potential for psychological manipulation, and the brutal internal politics that erupt when human ego intersects with perceived divine authority.
But the pinnacle of integrating intense theological debate with the pressurized environment of the monastery is undoubtedly Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose.
Published in 1980, Eco engineered the ultimate intellectual thriller.
He sets the narrative in a 14th century Italian abbey, utilizing a very real, incredibly dense historical theological debate.
The bitter conflict between the Franciscan and Dominican orders regarding the absolute poverty of Christ.
And uses it as the foundational motive for a labyrinthine murder mystery.
This raises an important question structurally speaking. Why does the monastery serve as such an unparalleled environment for a thriller?
Because it is the quintessential locked room environment, but magnified to the scale of a community.
You have a completely sealed ecosystem with a finite, documented population.
You have a labyrinthine architectural layout, hidden libraries, restricted zones, subterranean passages.
But most importantly, you have an environment where behavior is so heavily regimented, where the daily schedule is dictated down to the minute, that any deviation is catastrophic.
In a secular city, an anomaly goes unnoticed.
In a monastery where everyone is expected to be at exactly the same place at exactly the same time, an empty seat in the choir is a massive, highly visible structural failure.
The rigidity of the rules amplifies the drama of the transgression.
The environment acts as a pressure cooker for human behavior.
And this fundamental human drive to forge these intense, highly disciplined enclaves is so pervasive that it actively emerges even within theological systems designed to suppress it.
The historical development within Islam presents a striking paradox in this regard.
The dynamic within Islam is fascinating because the foundational texts are explicitly anti-monastic.
The Quran directly addresses the concept of monasticism and dismisses it as a human invention, an unauthorized deviation from the intended path.
The theological framework of Islam emphasizes integration with society, not withdrawal from it.
Yet, the psychological impulse for ascetic withdrawal and mystical pursuit cannot be legislated out of existence.
While Islam actively discouraged the massive cenobitic complexes seen in Buddhism or Christianity, the human desire for a dedicated ascetic pathway to the divine manifested through the emergence of Sufism.
Muslim mystics, desiring a more direct experiential union with Allah, adopted rigorous ascetic practices that closely mirrored the renunciate lifestyles of other traditions.
A primary physical marker of this withdrawal was the adoption of an abrasive, coarse woolen garment.
And the linguistic origin of the movement is tied directly to that garment. The Arabic word for that coarse wool is suf.
Precisely. The term Sufism derives from Sufi, identifying the practitioner who wears the wool as a symbol of their rejection of worldly comfort.
They may not have constructed the sprawling, self-contained cities of Pachomius,
but they successfully engineered a parallel monastic reality.
a deeply committed network of practitioners prioritizing asceticism, mystic union, and internal discipline, operating within a religion that structurally rejected the monastic premise.
It proves that you can dismantle the physical architecture and outlaw the administrative institution, but you cannot eradicate the underlying human impulse.
There is a deeply embedded psychological mechanism that occasionally demands we sever ties with the noise of the prevailing culture, adopt a posture of extreme discipline, whether that means a hair shirt or coarse woolen robe, and focus entirely on a singular internal or intellectual objective.
That resilient, adaptable human impulse is the central thread connecting everything we have analyzed today.
And the scope of that analysis is incredible. We have tracked this concept from the rain-soaked pavilions of early Buddhist India, where environmental pragmatism forced wanderers to settle,
to the brutal Egyptian deserts where the organizational genius of the Roman military was repurposed to manage tens of thousands of ascetic hermits.
We have examined how these isolated outposts evolved into the foundational pillars of medieval civilization,
Operating as frontline hospitals during plagues.
preserving global knowledge
Right.
and laying the exact architectural and administrative blueprints for the modern university system.
We've seen the economic realities warp these institutions into vast, hereditary, feudal estates in Tibet and Japan.
And track their adaptation straight into the 21st century, where cloistered monks are offering corporate IT and accounting services.
The historical reality proves that the monastery is not a static, silent monument to the past.
It is an incredibly dynamic, aggressively adaptable, and highly resilient framework for human organization.
So the next time the word monastery is invoked, do not just envision a passive, quiet stone building.
Recognize it as a highly sophisticated, historically vital engine of human civilization.
And applying this to our contemporary reality, the core utility of the monastic impulse feels more urgent than ever.
We are navigating an era defined by aggressive digital noise, unrelenting connectivity, and severe information overload.
The fact that you are engaging with this deep dive is an exercise in that exact impulse.
Curating your inputs, shutting out the peripheral noise, and focusing intently on a singular, complex narrative.
The fundamental drive to withdraw from the mainstream current, to establish an intentional boundary, and to cultivate focus has never been more relevant.
The modern pursuit of deep work or digital minimalism is simply a secularized manifestation of the same psychological imperative that drove early ascetics into the Nitrian desert.
So what does this all mean for the architecture of our modern lives?
I want to leave you with one final structural provocation, drawing on a very specific, almost contradictory system utilized in Greece and Cyprus under Ottoman rule.
We have heavily contrasted the absolute isolation of the hermit with the total collectivization of the cenobium.
But there is a hybrid model known as the idiorhythmic lifestyle.
It is a fascinating administrative compromise that challenges our binary understanding of community.
Under the idiorhythmic framework, practitioners co-locate within a shared architectural complex, but the economic and operational integration stops there.
They retain absolute individual ownership of their assets.
They dictate their own schedules, and critically, there is zero obligation to labor for the common economic good of the complex.
They share the physical geography, but maintain total individual autonomy.
It is the privatization of the cenobitic space.
Exactly.
So I want you to consider the mechanics of that arrangement. Is a 15th century idiorhythmic monastery fundamentally any different from the operational model of a modern premium co-working space?
Or the economic reality of a high-density urban apartment shared by roommates who aggressively divide the utility bills, label their individual groceries, and operate on entirely separate schedules.
You are sharing the overhead costs of the infrastructure, but you are entirely insulated within your own economic and operational silo.
It suggests that the boundary separating ancient, specialized ascetic organization from the fragmented reality of modern urban living is largely an illusion.
Think about the structural parallels the next time you are sharing a table at a crowded coffee shop, surrounded by people, yet entirely isolated inside your noise-canceling headphones. Until next time, keep diving deep.